to share their work, to talk about their work, to create dialogue in this most uncertain time. And I won't talk much longer because you're here to listen to Patricia. But I will say this, we are actually, we hope you will look on our website to see our open call for submissions for call for healing and community. And it will be a virtual exhibition. And we hope that if you haven't already, you'll consider submitting for this really exciting opportunity. So without any further ado, I turn this over to Patricia Miranda. And thank you all so much.
Hi, how's everybody doing? I know you're probably muted, but Joanna, did you want to say anything before we get started, or should I just jump in?
Just real quick, everyone, as we did for the first workshop, this one is being recorded. So if you do not want to appear, let us know. And the idea of recording it is also to have it on the website. So anyone who would like to access it afterwards can. So that's it.
Okay, so I'm going to jump right in because we have a short amount of time and I have lots of really great information to share. First, I want to thank Nidia and Joanna and NoMAA, awesome, and Michelle for this opportunity. I've really been teaching professional practice for more than 15 years, and I really am a big advocate of artist-run culture and artists supporting one another and creating community, that artists are a constituency, that we can join together and share resources and, you know, develop new ways to kind of share our work, show our work, share opportunities and everything like that. So tonight is going to be sort of a real pragmatic workshop, kind of dig a little into the weeds with digital images. I'm going to speak a little bit broadly about digital image preparation and then, in other words, more broadly than the NoMAA exhibition. So they'll cover ways of preparing images for the submission for the show that I am super excited to be curating, but also a little bit about, you know, digital images in general. So I think there's one of the things that I know as being both an artist and a curator, so both an artist and an administrator, I see these processes from both sides of the desk, so to speak. I experience them myself, the enormous amount of work that it requires, the kind of administrative work that it requires to be an artist today, the enormous opportunity that is available to us because of that, because of, you know, of the web and social media and different ways you can engage. And, you know, the challenges, it really is like a part-time job doing the administrative stuff, as I'm sure you all can attest. So I'm really pragmatic. I'm really into building structures that help us to be able to get these things done in ways that don't, you know, that support our work. The other thing is being on the other side of it, having been on grant panels and jury panels and residency panels, I've seen really firsthand many of the things that that happen that are really hard for us to see as artists when we're behind our desk. So I hope I'm going to try and you know, cover some of that. So for you, probably what's easy, because we only have a very short period of time, is if you guys want to type questions into the chat as we go along. I'll try and keep a little monitor of it. And, you know, Michelle, feel free to say this is a good question for this moment. And I'll try, if I don't answer it during, if I think it's relevant to what I'm talking about in the moment, I'll try and answer it then. Otherwise, we'll leave time at the end to answer the questions that are in the chat. You know, technically, sometimes it can be hard to kind of switching voices and everything else, as you know, so it might just be easier with the chat. But at the end, we'll have time, hopefully, and to kind of do a little of both if we can. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to kind of do a couple of different things, but I'll try and give you some really practical information. So first, yeah, again, thank you. I'm Patricia. Really nice to see you guys, and the wind is banging the door, so hopefully that's not bothering you guys. So what we're going to cover is really practical information about understanding digital images, and really understanding them not from the position of someone who is necessarily a digital creator. In other words, not someone who's making native digital files, but we're really talking about documentation here, okay? So it's very specific to how an artist prepares images of their work to submit them for many, many different opportunities. That would include exhibitions, juried shows, that would include perhaps grant applications or artist residencies, or even if you're applying to university or something like that. Excuse me. So we're going to cover, hopefully we'll get through all of this. Probably the organized files we won't, but I also am I'll be giving NoMA a handout. So some of this information that might be a little, in a moment, technical, like you might not, get all that information in a momentary slide. I will have a detailed handout for you, which will also have resources. So let's get started. So I always say that you live and die by your documentation. I think I need to change that phrase now in this time of the pandemic. But what I mean by that is that, we are artists. We make these objects and these experiences that are things that we want people to experience in real life, right? They're really meant to be seen in person. At the same time, in today's world, even before we've been sort of, quarantined, 99% of the people who will encounter your work will encounter it digitally. So we need to understand how to present our work in the best light possible in a digital environment. Now, some people's work translates, it's like a translation. If I was to translate a poem from Russian into Spanish, right? It's both beautiful languages, but they're different languages. So we have to understand that what we're doing is we're trying to give the person who is receiving the images the best ability to see what our work actually looks like. And that means we have to kind of understand that in a slightly different way than we might understand it in relationship to our own feelings about the work. So really what you're doing is you're making a case for your work. So there's no one size fits all for preparing work samples. For example, some people's work looks fantastic digitally. If your work is very graphic, it has very bright saturated colors, those things will, in general, again, generalizations here, but they are true, will tend to translate very well digitally. If you make work that is extremely subtle or uses materials that are very complex or very tactile, stuff like that, then sometimes it can be much more difficult, or you have a slightly different job to do in preparing your images. My work, for example, is often very hard to photograph because I'm using tactile materials like textile, and I'm using natural dyes. Sometimes that means I have an extra challenge in preparing those images to make sure that people can see what the work actually looks like. So the first thing that you need to remember is that what you can control. One of the things that I see is, and what you can control is how you prepare your, I'm going to use the term packages, which just means like whatever it is that you're sending to whatever organization, right? So that could be a couple of images for a juried show. It could be, an entire proposal for an exhibition or a grant. What you can control is how that object, how that package looks when it arrives on that person's desk, so to speak, right? You can't control how people will necessarily respond. You can't control the context within which that work is going to be viewed. You can control how it will arrive on that person's desk. The number one thing is to pay attention to instructions. Follow the instructions exactly. This is, harder than it sounds, right? Everyone says, well, that's not hard. Why can't you follow instructions? But sometimes these instructions are, they're like in the weeds, so to speak. I'm going to talk about some of that kind of stuff here. Now, if you are applying for grants, juried shows, all kinds of things, but especially things where there are, juried, right. This is the first time I'm curating for NoMAA, so this will be the first time I will be doing this. Last time it might have been someone else, next time it might be someone else. So every time you apply to something, the panels who are reviewing the work are different, especially with grants and everything else. It's always a different panel. There's generally people, and I can talk about that in more detail a little bit later on. So remember that every time you get your work in front of a panel, people are seeing your work. People in the arts are seeing your work. It doesn't always, help assuage the rejection we might feel when we don't get accepted into things, but it does mean that your work is being circulated amongst people who care about it. And if you are paying attention to instructions and really following them, basically what you're doing is you are making it easy for those people to see your work. So in different instances, you can, just move this here, but you don't always know how your images will be viewed. You can contact an organization to ask them how the images will be viewed. For example, in larger grant programs like NIFA or something like that, they're going to project the images in a very particular way. Maybe it's 4 at a time, 3 at a time, on a black background, on a laptop. There are different ways you can ask. There is always some person whose job it is to answer questions for people who are applying to things. The administrators who administer these opportunities, that's their job. People are very nice. What I would say is, though, don't ask questions that you haven't taken the time to just check the instructions, right? Don't bother people in, arts organizations everyone's overworked and underpaid doing the job of 4 people. So ask questions that really are, you need to know the answer, that you haven't been able to figure out on your own. Knowing how the work is going to be viewed can help you organize those images. Uh-oh, why am I not? All right, we're going to do this way. Okay, so we're going to talk about understanding digital files. Now, here I'm going to be talking about things that some of you will be very well versed in this information. Some of you will, all of you have heard some of it, and some of you it may be a little less familiar. Again, I'm talking about these files very particularly for preparation of, for documentation preparation for opportunities. So it's in that light that I am speaking about this. So again, some of this you're gonna know, and sorry, I have my other computer here. So there's different kinds of files there are a lot of different digital files, but the ones that we need to be concerned about most particularly are these 3 files. Sorry, I'm just going to do that. So the first one is raw files. Now, one of the things about digital photography, this is what I always say, the amazing thing about digital photography is that everybody can take a picture. And the worst thing about digital photography is that everyone can take a picture, right? This means that we all imagine that we are photographers. And documentation photography is it's like its own category. And although we can take relatively decent images on our phone, really, really professional images are taken with a camera, and understanding that that is a bit different. The lenses are different, et cetera, et cetera. So a raw file is a file that is taken by an SLR camera. That's not a point and shoot. That's a camera where you can put things on manual, right? The raw file is not, think of it as a negative, right? Remember that? Remember those days? I'm old enough to remember when we had negatives, right? Now a negative is not something you can use, right? It's a file in a sense that has all of the information that the camera saw, that the camera recorded, but it has to be processed in order to be used. You don't use a negative, you process the negative. So think of a raw file like that. It has tons of information, it's a huge file, but you can't do anything with it. You can't do anything with it until you process it. So the way you would process it, or the files that we would be processing into, are things like TIFFs. Raw files are uncompressed files, right? They contain tons and tons and tons of data. So a TIFF file is a processed file, but it is also uncompressed. It has enormous amounts of data. TIFFs are very large files, right? Every single thing that camera saw is in your TIFF. JPEGs, which is probably what everybody's heard of and everybody uses, are compressed files. These are files that are used, that are practical files, right? The TIFFs are really for special circumstance. Those are your master files. JPEGs are your workaday files. JPEGs are compressed files. Basically, that means even a large JPEG that has a lot of data is still a compressed file. They are smaller than a TIFF. Even a large JPEG compresses information, which basically means that the camera has the computer has thrown out some of the data that is in the TIFF or the raw file in order to make a smaller file so it is more usable. The thing you need to remember about JPEGs, and that people often don't know, is that every time you edit a JPEG and close it and open it again, it's like a generation. It deteriorates. JPEGs are not like, what's the word? They're like perishable files. Think of them like things that should not be used over and over again. Now, if you don't edit it, you can reuse a JPEG. In other words, you can send it over and over again. But if you open it up, change something, change the color, adjust the lighting, change the size, then that JPEG will deteriorate. So what I always recommend people do is keep a file, or a folder, sorry, has what I call your master files. Now these may be TIFFs, they may be raw files. They should not be JPEGs, really. Although when you're taking pictures from your phone, the phone is processing them into JPEGs. So if you have JPEGs, when you first have a JPEG, keep like one copy of that JPEG that is the master file, right? Don't do anything to that one. Every time you want to do something, copy that JPEG, right? Copy it and then edit it. And that way you're making a new file each time. Make sense? Again, you can always type questions. And these two I'm not going to talk about too much, a PNG or a GIF, or sometimes you can also hear it spoken of as a GIF or a GIF. They're both fine, they're both correct. These are like JPEGs, but they're much smaller. These are really good for webs, like memes, all this kind of stuff where you want something that loads very quickly. It only has a very little bit of data. These are not going to be good for documentation images. They are good for the web. Now, I know that we do documentation on the web, and there might be, you know, circumstances where a PNG or a GIF is okay, but for the most part, you're going to be dealing with, in documentation, you're going to be dealing with JPEGs. Now, I mentioned a PDF. Only reason I mentioned a PDF is because it's not an image file technically, but you've probably all had PDFs and opened PDFs. But one of the things when you are sending documents such as like a CV or an artist statement, anything that is a Word document or pages or a text, anything that's like a text document, the formatting that's in that document may not be preserved when that person opens it, right? So if you've spent hours and hours formatting your CV and then you send it to someone as a Word doc and their computer opens it up, the formatting might be wonky. So a PDF is basically like a picture of a document so that when you send it, it preserves the layout. So I recommend that whenever you send documents, you make them into PDFs, except of course, when the instructions are to send a Word document. Then you follow instructions first and foremost. Okay, so pixels, I know it seems like these are really simple things, but they're really important to understand. Pixels are the smallest controllable element in any image. Basically, pixels are little squares. Every picture is made up, every digital picture is made up of little tiny squares. And I know that we all know this, but I find this is the place where the most confusion lies in terms of people understanding how to prepare digital images. Oops. So, okay, I'm going to go on to talk about it. File size is basically measured in kilobytes, megabytes, or gigabytes. It's like 1,000 kilobytes is a megabyte, 1,000 megabytes is a gigabyte. Very simple to understand. Now we are, of course, working in even terabytes. Now we're not going to have terabyte images unless you're doing animation, in which case you would. But this will tell you, it'll give you a little hint on how large the file is. So pixels are what pixels blend together to give the illusion of a smooth gradations of tone and color so that you can see a smooth image and you don't see the pixels. We've all seen pixelated images, which you see here with the cat. If you take the same number of pixels and you spread them over more inches, right, you will see the pixels because if I was to say that this image has 600 pixels, if this image was, for example, 600 pixels wide, that means that's how many pixels are in this image. That doesn't change. That is static, right? 600 pixels wide. If I make that image 18 inches, right, I have to spread 600 pixels over 18 inches. Those pixels become very large. You get a pixelated image. Make sense? I'm going to show you some examples of that. So I love this. I love to show a mosaic because a mosaic is, in actuality, the original pixel, right? It's an image made up of little squares. Now, if you blur your eyes and look at this image, you'll see the more smooth it looks, or if the smaller those tesserae are, the little squares, the more continuous or smooth that picture will look. The bigger the squares, the more pixelated it looks. It's exactly the same. So megapixels are just the total number of pixels in the entire image, right? Now, this is the other place, this is the places where I find the most confusion in my experience. We throw this term around a lot, DPI. Dots per inch is actually a term that came from dot matrix printers. And because you say something has 300 DPI, doesn't mean anything because you don't know how many inches those 300 dots are spread over, right? So this is the important to think. I want us to stop thinking about DPI and start thinking about just translate it to PPI, because this is how you will begin to understand it. So PPI is the number of pixels per inch displayed on the screen, right? It's relative to the display size measured in inches. So if I want to say this image had 900 pixels, it was 900 pixels across. If I spread that across, if I want to have 300 pixels per inch, how many inches is that going to be? If it's only 900, that image is going to be 3 inches wide, right? If I want an image that is actually 10 inches wide, I am spreading those pixels over a much wider area, and I'm making a much less high resolution image. So sometimes people will say, I need an image that's 300 DPI or 72 DPI. Without the other aspect ratio, in other words, I want 72 inches at 8 by 10, right? You really don't know what that could be, because you can change the DPI without changing the number of pixels. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'm going to show you some examples. So just some, basic backgrounds and basic guidelines, and these again are, these are not absolutes. And of course, with computers changing all the time, these things also change. And let me know if I talk too fast, because I do have a tendency to do that. So emails, you're going to want small files. You don't want people are not going to open up a 50 megabyte file, something with 3,000 pixels. That's going to be a very large file for email. You want something that's around 400 pixels, 600 pixels. That's at the longest dimension, right? So it might be 600 by 300, whatever the longest dimension is. That's how we kind of determine, we set the kind of parameters. For websites, you can do 600 to 800. Sometimes people will do up to 11 for a nice big image. Your printers, your home printers, your standard ones that are not, really high-end Epson printers are going to print at around 200 PPI. That's the highest that they'll print in. And then when you're doing portfolios, if you're submitting, again, submitting something where someone has not given you a file size, a specific file size, 2000 is a nice, between 1100 to 2000 is a really good dimension, right? It's a nice hefty image, but it's not huge. It's not going to be 13 megabytes. Nobody is going to open enormous files like that unless they have specifically asked for it. The time when you're going to have really large files or when you're going to be printing things like IRL, right? You want something that's on paper, those have to be big files. That means 300 PPI at 8 by 10. That is the minimum for printing. That means you have an 8-inch wide image, 300 inches, 300 pixels per inch, right? That means it will be 2,400 pixels across. Does that make sense? Okay. So remember, very, very important. This is why I say save your large files as your master files. Don't ever touch those, only copy them. Because if you accidentally, right, take a file that is 2,400 pixels across at the longest dimension and you turn it into an 800 pixel wide image, you have thrown away those pixels. You can never get them back, right? So if you have to resize an image, take your JPEG or your TIFF, make a copy. I recommend making a copy into a folder that has the name of the opportunity that you're applying for, put it in there, then change the size. That means that the master image file, right, has not been touched. Make sense? If you try and upsize an image, basically what happens, you can do it. I can take an image that has only 600 pixels wide, and I can go into Photoshop or what have you and make it 900 pixels wide. But what happens is the computer makes up that information. It basically says, oh, there's a green pixel. I think we need another green pixel. So it will give you a bigger file, right? But it will not give you a better file. In fact, it will give you a very poor file. So remember, you can always make a file smaller, but you don't want to make a file bigger. There are some wonky exceptions to that that are not really important for us right now. So the most important thing, again, is to follow the specific guidelines that for whatever that opportunity is. And if they're not clear, very often I have come across things where it says, we want an image that's 72 PPI. Well, that 72 PPI could be at 72 PPI at 8 by 10 at 56 by 72, right? You need to just ask them, 72 PPI at what dimension? So file labeling, this is another one that I just find a constant issue. People will send me things and every single thing is IMG 1223. You've probably all had this experience. make sure that you name your files. In other words, every time you send something out, and believe me, I've done that. I've not done this sometimes. It's, you know, it's difficult it's challenging to keep up with all of this stuff. But the point is that when you send an image out, you want your name on it. You know, you want people to know who it is, because once that image becomes detached from, you know, whatever, like the email that you sent, there's no way for that person to identify where that file came from, right? And I get unnamed files all the time. And I can tell you that there were, I have many examples, but one time when I was gallery director at a university and had asked for, you know, information from artists, I got 50 responses, and I would say about 75% of them had file names like artist statement or right, CV. I have no idea who, and sometimes there wasn't even identifying information in the actual document. So if your name is not attached to it, do not assume that that person can track down your email. Now, even when you're uploading images into a, you know, a system. Now everyone has FTP systems where you upload images like Submittable and all of these, right? Slide file, what's the name of that one? Where you can, you know, upload your images there. Even then, even though you're putting it into like a field which has the information, you know, and it's attached and everything else, you still want your name attached to that file. So always name your files. Make sure that your name is in it. The easiest thing is just last name, first name, or last name, initial. 01 underscore last name underscore first name initial. Always use 2 digits, just because it's a convention, but also if you have more than 10 images, the computer will sort it like 01, 11, right? It will not sort it in what you call sequential. It'll sort it by number. So just use 2 digits. Just, you know, the thing is, if you just institute these as a thing, you get used to them, you do it all the time, then you never have an issue. If you don't number them, then the computer will sort them. In other words, if you named your files with like the titles of the images and no number, the computer will sort it it'll sort it alphabetically. And maybe that is not the order that you wanted the person to view them in. Okay, image list. This is basically a separate document that will be for opportunities where you have a group of images, right? You're submitting 10 images and there's going to be a separate document. Just make sure that all of the information is there, and you'll get this in the handout. So I don't think I have to spend too much time on this, but make sure that the file 01, you know, attaches to references the correct file, right? The convention is height by width by depth, always in that order. You don't have to have depth if it's a painting. Some paintings are deep and you want them, you know, you want that to be known. Sometimes they're not. Use inches, not feet. You can use centimeters. The convention everywhere else is centimeters. Sometimes artists who are especially working internationally, whatever, will have both inches and centimeters. Okay. You can put thumbnails here, but I'm not going to talk about that now. Okay, so these are some of the, and I'm sorry to rush through, but we want to make sure I have time for questions and everything else. And you're going to get that information in the handout. So this is a list. So I'm going to talk about Photoshop. I'm going to show you a couple of things in Photoshop just to give you a sense of some of the things that I'm talking about. These are some of the free alternatives to Photoshop. Photoshop is, and the whole Adobe suite. The Adobe suite has Photoshop, it has Bridge, it has InDesign, it has a whole bunch of programs. You can also get them individually. Everything is cloud-based now, so you don't have to buy Photoshop, which is a very expensive program, but it is not free. So you can get Photoshop for in the neighborhood of $7 to $10 a month. Now, which that may be too much. And if you're just using these programs for, you know, working on just, you know, moderate corrections to your images and resizing, you may not need Photoshop. And so these are some of the alternatives. Again, you'll get this list in your handout. Now, okay, so now I'm going to switch to Photoshop to show you. Now I'm using Photoshop again. Many artists or photographers use Lightroom. Photoshop and Lightroom and Bridge are the sort of most common ones used in the arts. But again, there are some very good free programs that can do pretty much everything that I'm showing you. Now, here's an image in Photoshop, and you can see down here, can you guys see that that says it's 33%, right? That means I'm viewing this image. It's down here at the bottom. It means I'm viewing this image at 33% of its actual size. I'm going to go into image size so I can show you. So here we go. Do you see this? This image it's a large image. It's got 34, I see someone had a question. I'll come back to you. It's a big file. It's 34 megabytes, right? It has 4,000 pixels and it's 300 ppi, right? That means those 4,000 pixels are spread across 13 inches. I'm going to just turn this off for a second. Well, I'll show you something. This constrained proportions, anytime you make changes, you will always have constrained proportions on, because if you do not, I can do something like this and I will end up distorting my image, right? So always keep constrained proportions. There's almost no time where you're going to turn that off. What you will turn off though, however, is this. So this is the actual number of pixels in that image. Here is the resolution. That means how many pixels per inch. And when I do that, when I divide that math, 4,000 by 300, I get 13 inches. If I change this to, let's see, 60, then I have the same number of pixels. That has not changed. I am just spreading those same number of pixels over a wider distance, and so I have a lower resolution, okay? Now, if I want to resample this image, in other words, I want to change. Now I've copied this image. This is not my master file, let us just say. I've copied this image into a folder, and I know that NoMA does not want me to send them a 34 megabyte file because that's just too big. So I have to change this. I'm going to change it to, let's just change it to, and again, excuse me, at the widest dimension, right? You always go with the widest. As long as constrained proportions is on, it will automatically shift the other dimension correctly. So if I said I want this to be, let's say I want it to be 1100. See, I've made a much bigger file. It's still showing at 33%, right? But 33% is now very small. I'm going to just move this so I can make this bigger so you can see this. Oops. So I now have an image that is 300 ppi, but it's only 4 inches wide, right? Because I have removed many of those pixels. Now, if I want to make this bigger again, I would have to go back to my master file. And I want to see if I can show you. Can you see that little 50% here? If I make this 100%, it'll show that this is how big that picture is. If I had taken the bigger file, the one that was 4,000 across, and put it at, instead of 33%, put it at 100%, we would only be seeing a small section of it because that image would be so large. Okay, now I'm going to show you something else. I'm going to take you into Bridge, and we're just a little bit more. I'm going to show you. So this is Bridge. Now, Bridge is an amazing, I have to move this out of the way here. Okay, Bridge is an amazing program. Bridge, by the way, is completely free for anybody to use. You can download Bridge for free. Now, when you do download Bridge, Bridge is a viewing program, right? It's kind of like File Manager or Finder, except that you can do things here in it. It is a godsend for artists. It's an organizing program. If you download Bridge, but you don't have Photoshop, then you will be limited. You can't do any photo editing, but you can do a bunch of other things. So I've got an opportunity and I have to pick, 10 of these images, right? Or maybe 8 of these images. And so I put all of these big images, it's not a random, but it's a group of images that I know I want to pick from. And I'm going to see, one of the things you can do with Bridge is you can do a little slideshow to see the order you want to put them in. And it allows you to move things around so that you can see, so that I could do this slideshow again, right? And see these things in a different order. So if I was to say, I'm just moving these around because I'm curating my images, which I'm going to talk about again in a second. I'm putting the images in the order that I want the organization to see them in. I'm trying to decide, Curating your images is incredibly important. If you don't curate your images, basically think about it as like a mini solo show. You want people to see things in the order that makes sense, that builds a case for the work, that makes, that kind of shows the you know, the breadth of your work, and also puts it together in a way that makes it look like a body of ideas made by a single artist, a coherent vision, rather than, sometimes I think artists, we curate chronologically or emotionally, right? So either in the order that we made it, or like the things that we care about the most. This is not always the most objective way to put together a body of work that will make someone understand what we're thinking about, you know, and present our work in the best light possible. The great thing about Bridge is that you can do things like, I can star them, you know, so that I can just look at just the starred ones. It'll show me just the ones that I've starred. I can move them around in all sorts of ways. And then one of the best things that when they invented this, made every artist that I know jump for joy, is I have to rename these files. Now you'll notice also that there's some TIFFs here and there are some JPEGs. There's both, right? So I've decided that this is the order that I'm going to put these in. But I realize that these 3 books don't really make sense. So I'm going to just use these other images, right? I'm going to select these images. I'm going to go into Tools, and I'm going to do something called Batch Rename. This means that I can go in and I can rename in the same folder. So the same images will be renamed. I can number them. I could make, this could be however many digits, just keep it at 2 digits. I can add text. I can add additional text if I want. But really, all I need is the sequence number and my name. I'm going to change this to the convention that I said, which is Miranda P. I'm going to rename, and all things being right in the universe, it has just renamed all of those files for me in a second. To do that manually is just enormously difficult, really, really hard. The other thing that it can do, and this is the last thing I'll show you, although there's many other things it can do, you notice that I have TIFFs and I have other things here. So now these images are in the order that I want them to be in, right? There's a way to batch in Photoshop. Image processor, you're going to get these instructions. This is something you can also do in the free program. So, but I'm showing it to you because there's going to be some similar version in some of these other ones. I can save it as a JPEG, always quality 12. I don't care how small you're making the image, keep it there. I'm going to resize it, and I'm going to resize it to, let's say, 1100. So, and then I click, I'm saving it in the same location. And just watch the magic happen. It's processing those images for me in just, you know, it takes about a minute or something like that. And then voila, once it's done, let's give it a second. I can go into this folder, and there I have all of my images, right? Renamed in the size that I want, and they're all JPEGs and they're all exactly the size. Now, one of the things you can see is over here in the metadata, you see this? This image we can see is now 1100. If I go through, 1100, 1100, the widest dimension is 1100. It also tells me that it's at 300 PPI, but this one's at 72, this one is at 300. They're both 1100 wide, right? Again, PPI is relative to the size of the image. One last thing I'm going to tell you about this, and then we're going to come back and kind of wrap up, is in the metadata, you can actually add in, and you can do this in most of these viewing programs. It's metadata. You can actually go in there, and I can put my information in. I can put my address. I wouldn't put my home address. I'd put my website, right? That means you can even put information about copyright, etc. That means when this file travels anywhere, this is like a way added level, right? If we're going to do this, this is a little more work, but if you're concerned about your images going out and being somewhat protected, this will remain in the metadata wherever that file goes. All right, I'm going to go back to, my PowerPoint here. Just give me a sec. And we're going to, so I have this information, which you'll see. I'm going to just go through this because we don't need that. That information is in the, will be in the handout. Now, last things I'm going to talk about is the do's and don'ts. What makes a good image? You want to submit images that clearly represent your work. Remember, you are making a case for your work. You are the only one who knows what that work really looks like and how you want people to see it. Remember, you're trying to give someone else who doesn't know you, who doesn't know your work, has not seen it in person, the ability to see what it is that you do. Really difficult and challenging, but I cannot stress enough how important good photographs are. Neutral backgrounds, white, black, or gray. Don't have, you know, picture frames, don't have furniture, don't have wallpaper, don't have grass, don't have other things in the picture, unless, of course, there's exceptions to everything, it is an installation, right? And there are reasons why those things are. The only reason there should be a picture frame in your image is if that picture frame is part of the work. In other words, it's not a picture frame that is, you know, meant to kind of go around the picture after you're done. No stuff in there. And installations shots can help establish scale and show context. So sometimes if your work is very large or very small, digital images, you can't tell the scale from a digital image, right? It's on my screen. All things look the same. So if it's really important for you to be able to communicate that this image is really big, then having an image of like a gallery shot, you know, the images on a wall in a room, something like that can be really, really helpful. And there are even digital, like museums now, you can, where there's a beautiful wall and you can put your work there in the space if you don't have the ability to kind of do that yourself. In today's world, paintings are often photographed with a small amount of wall around it. Now, we used to always say crop images, crop paintings right to the edge so you don't see an edge. It's not that you can't still do that. Obviously you can, but remember, we're in an almost entirely digital world right now. So when a painting is cropped right to the edge, sometimes it can be very difficult to tell what it actually is. I cannot tell sometimes if it's a digital image or if it is a painting, because the cropping the edge will flatten, right, and make it seem more graphic. So if you photograph your work with like an inch of space around the whole painting, that can be really helpful for me to understand that a painting is an object. And today's world, the fact that a painting is an object is enormously important for people to know, right? So I recommend, and again, always exceptions, but I recommend that you photograph paintings with a little bit of space around. Not too much, you don't want furniture, you don't want window frames and all that, just a little bit of space, so if there's a shadow, you can see that, right? Sculpture can often be good on a neutral gray background to give it a spatial effect, but if it's, or an installation shot. Sculpture is often great with an installation shot, but if you're small, your work is small and it goes on a pedestal, sometimes a gray background looks a little less graphic and gives a more atmosphere, right? So you can see kind of air around the sculpture. High key images may flatten it, make it look a little more graphic and flatten it a little bit. Now that might be the best thing for the work, but it might not be, okay? Now we don't all have projectors, but the best thing is to make sure that you look at your photo in whatever viewing program you're in at 100%. You will be able to tell if that image is actually good, if it is not blurry, because if it's small on your screen, you often cannot tell. And just because it has a lot of pixels doesn't mean it's a good photograph. So again, curating, I mentioned, and we're just wrapping up very, very much here. You want to think of your group of images as a mini solo exhibition, even if you're only submitting 5 images. I mean, really, I cannot tell you how much, if curators see 5 images and they don't seem to be related to one another, they seem to be kind of all over the place, that will count against the artist. I can just tell you that, because people are looking for some kind of cohesive vision. It doesn't mean that everything has to look the same, right? It doesn't mean like, I have a landscape with a house, they all have to be landscapes with houses. But it just can't begin to look like disjointed or like that 5 different people. It's not your moment to show people all the different things you can do. It's your moment to show people the sort of cohesive, concrete body of ideas that you are working with. this is a little bit, I think, outside. I'm gonna not go into this. This is more like if you're doing an entire proposal, like a grant proposal, you'll have a lot more information that you need to do. So you'll have the proposal, right? The written proposal and the pictures. Those things need to line up. If they don't line up, people will not understand. They will be, why is this image with this information? It's true about your artist statement. If your artist statement seems to have nothing to do or doesn't relate in some concrete way to the images that the person is looking at, that can count against your work. And I know artist statements, I could lecture on that for hours. They're really hard for artists to write, but they're simple, concrete, descriptive documents. So keep it really simple. You really need to show recent work unless there's a good reason. Some people work in very large projects, long-term projects, et cetera, et cetera. People don't want you to be submitting stuff from many years ago unless there's a good reason. And there may be a good reason and you can make that, but so what's good is to kind of have somebody who doesn't really, maybe not an artist. Maybe they're an artist but they're not, or maybe they're an administrator. Someone who will give you an honest opinion about the selection and how you've organized them. Remember, you can ask the administrative organizations, the administrators, questions if there's any issues, and always, always, always follow the directions. I cannot say that enough. The directions are there to what's the word? Even the playing field, so that it's hard, right, to level the playing field. We're all at different places. Some people are known, some people are unknown. The fact that you follow directions means that your work will be put on the same level as somebody who might have a much bigger career, and you won't be disqualified for not having followed the directions, because that does happen. So you really know how to present your work the best. Remember, the person looking at it doesn't know you. They don't know your work. They have no information. What they have is what you give them. So think of them when you are always think of the person who's receiving it. How are you making it easy for them? How are you making things visible? How are you making it like really clear what they're looking at, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if I said it earlier, but I think it was in there, but people often write mixed media. And I've found as a curator that I find that term really problematic because of the difficulty in sometimes understanding, what a digital image actually is. You know what I mean? If I'm looking at someone and someone just says mixed media and I'm looking, I'm like, I can't really tell. I can't tell if it's painted or collage. I can't tell. So I recommend always listing the materials. You don't have to go too down a deep hole. Although if your materials are really important, then you might, but be clear. Mixed media is too general. I would say paper, collage, paper, I don't know, whatever it is, paper, paint, paper, acrylic paint, pencils, and whatever is in there, just name it, right? And I always have to quote Sharon Loudon, who's an awesome friend and amazing artist powerhouse. She says, I think artists have to deal with rejection a lot, and it can be a tough part of the process. But remember, it is not a rejection, it's a difference of opinion. When you apply for things, there are many, many reasons why one work is chosen and another one is not. It's not always because people didn't think the work was interesting or good or whatever. It can just be the other works that were submitted. It can be the agenda of the exhibition. It can be the mandate of the grant funders. It can be, maybe there's many people, many submissions this time whose work was like yours and they have to pick from them. So there are lots of different reasons. It can be really hard to take, but I can tell you that having been on both sides of that, try to remember that it's not a rejection, it's just a difference of opinion. And I think artists are some of the bravest people in the world, and art is necessary. And I am super excited about curating this show and getting to see all of your work. So hopefully I whizzed through that pretty quickly. I'm going to, can't see the chat when I'm in the slideshow, so I'm going to come out of that.
Thank you, Patricia. That was wonderful. I loved how the play of the use of shapes, colors, and font. So that artistic side that came through in the PowerPoint. I know we're 5 minutes away from 6. Is it okay if we run another 10 minutes or so for Q&A?
It's okay with me. If anybody needs to go, feel no embarrassment about that. Do what you need to do. Take care of yourself. And I hope everyone is safe and your loved ones are all safe and taking good care. But I'm happy to answer questions
So if you are leaving us, I have put the link to the evaluation form in the chat, and you'll also be receiving an email with that. So if you don't know where the chat is, it's the little speech bubble that says chat.
Yeah, sorry, I meant to say that.
Yes, so it'll be there, and you'll also be getting an email for that. And thank you for coming today. And should I unmute people to talk, or do you want to have chat?
Sure, either one. I think people can, it's not such a huge group. I think it's probably possible to have people ask questions.
So I've unmuted everybody. So if you do, speak up if you have a question, or type it in.
Anybody have any questions? Any clarifications or?
I have a question. Patricia, if you could talk a little bit about the curating. I know you covered a lot, and I liked it a lot. I was just being reminded when you did a brief intro this past summer with the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, and you did a presentation on curating. What would be your top 3 tips for self-curating work samples?
I think that thinking of it like a mini, I don't care if it's 3 images or it's 15 images. Think of it like an exhibition, right? You wouldn't hang images randomly, right? In an exhibition, you would think carefully about what's next to what, right? So when you're thinking about images in a sequence, remember, people are going to look at them sequentially. So it should make some kind of sense. In other words, you're building a case for the work. And so sometimes, like, our favorite image, right? What is our favorite image is not the one that needs to be first, right? I think you have to think of them as both a group and then as a kind of, I think of it as a visual narrative. And sometimes when you think of it as a visual narrative, there's like a visual break. I mean, if we had more time, I could go back to the images, but so it should feel like, it reads like, oh, every time I see another image, I have more information about the work and I know more about the information. For example, if you're going to do details, you pick a detail that tells me something that I cannot see in the first image. And also a detail that is, and this is particularly for people who work in either sculpture or large things, with paintings, maybe you don't always have a detail, but it's a similar idea that when I have one image, the detail these images need to do double duty. In other words, they need to tell me something about this work and inform me about how to see the next work, right? So if you give me an image and it has a lot of information that when I see the next one, I'm like, oh yes, I see what this artist is thinking about, right? It's like, build it like a story. That doesn't mean that you save the best for last. That's not the way this kind of story goes, because oftentimes, now with small images, like 5 images, you can bookend them, like, just like come out at the start with something fantastic, and then, going through more, again, thinking of it as body of ideas, and then end up with something really strong. If you have a larger group of images, people will sometimes, show preliminary images and this. You don't want to build up excitement, right? You want those first 4 images to just be like, sock them in the jaw, right? Like, they have to be fabulous, especially when there's a lot of images. And imagine you're a grant panelist and you are going through hundreds of these, right? You need to get people's attention really quickly. These are people who are well-versed at looking at images. They want to love your work, right? That's what they're there for. They're excited to see it, but don't hold back on the excitement, right? So that's some of the things I would say about curating your own images. I think it is one of the most difficult things for artists. It's so hard to curate your own images. I mean, I agonize over it, and other artists I know, we agonize over it. Even if it's 5 images, which 5 are going to, kind of tell the story most sort of, most completely? I mean, I don't mean completely like everything you've ever done, kind of completely, but which 5 images are going to present my work in the fullest way possible? So that's the way I would think about it. And, I think on the other side, of course, is, people are looking at a lot of images. I can tell you just really quickly, the way that usually these panels work is, it depends. Now, if it's a juried exhibition such as the NoMAA one, I'm going to be reviewing all of the images. I'm going to be looking at all of them very carefully. I will probably consult with Joanna and Nidia, possibly about that, but really I'm making the choices. And I'm thinking about And I'm going to be looking at them digitally, right? We're not looking at them projected because we're not able to do that under these circumstances, although I do have a projector actually, and I do use it on a regular basis. So I'm thinking I'm going to do that because projecting is really the best way to do it. But if it was a grant panel, the first round would be people looking on their computers first. This is the way it works. Generally because there's too many images for people to do all at one time. So depending on how many panelists, the works might be divided up into groups. So each panelist gets 40 to 60 applications to look at. They rate them on multiple criteria, anything from 1 to 5 for every one. And then all of the top rated ones from all of the panelists will be gathered together, and then they will meet in person. I can tell you this is how most of the major grant panels work, and residencies and stuff like that. Again, there's always exceptions, but a group of people are gathered, different people every year. They come together and they look at the images together, the top images together, and they spend an entire day. I was on a panel recently, it was a whole day. And people really debate, they really care about it, they really look at the work, and they agonize sometimes over those final decisions. So, people are really looking at the work. So even if you get rejected, right, or even if there's a difference of opinion, to quote Sharon, it's still an opportunity to have your work seen by people in the community. So someone asked about performing arts photos. Yeah, again, there's no one size fits all for any of these things, right? The thing with performing arts, and I would maybe compare it a little bit to like large installations, right? There's both information that is wide and, with a lot of information. So maybe you have multiple performers, maybe there are sets, maybe there's, you have to see the context, maybe it's outside. So you need kind of long shots and you need detail shots. But I would say you have to just think about every picture telling as much, like giving as much information as that picture can. So you have to think really carefully about the pictures. And I don't think that's different for any form. I think it's the same for performing arts. So sometimes you might only have, one shot of the entire, and more of the shots might be, like an interesting moment, right? An important moment of, if it's dancers, like a important moment of, the interaction of dancers' bodies or whatever. So because there's art is everything today, there's really no one way. But I would say for anything complex with a lot of information, those are often the hardest things to pick. And I would get as many pictures as you can and begin to kind of group them into sort of categories, like these are group shots, these are sort of intimate shots, these are wide shots, and then rate those, like the best ones of these, which of this, like one photo can give information about other photos, right? And that way you don't have to have 5 photos. You can tell in 2 photos what 5, I mean, we would love to have 5 more, right? But if you only have, very often with these panels, you have 5 to 10 images, and that is very expensive real estate. Every image is like a Madison Avenue, Upper East Side condo, right? Like every image is worth $5 million. You can't have any $1 million images in there. Everything's got to, everything really has to count. So I think, and if you're talking about want to show your sense of aesthetics, then that's got to be, that's got to be visible in the picture. If the aesthetic is, again, I don't know the art form, so I can't really speak particularly to it, because it could be a singer, right? That's going to be different if it's a single singer than if it's a dance troupe.
Mm.
But I think grouping the images and then rating them for yourself, like pulling out like the top 10 of each kind of top 10 wide shots, top 10 intimate shots, top 10, right, is helpful. It's helpful to kind of begin to call it.
I've found that I have absolutely no, I'm very biased with my own work, so I just ask my husband, I'm like, hey, which one jumps out at you? And just asking other people, because as you said, we think about these things emotionally, and you have a connection to it that, a third party wouldn't necessarily.
It is so hard to be objective about our own work. I mean, I'm very sympathetic about this. I mean, it's really, really hard. I agonize just as much as anybody else. I mean, really, I'll agonize over 2 images for the order, and it's good to show it to other people. Often, people who maybe don't know anything about the art form, and people that do, right? Yeah.
Any last questions that, or comments, concerns that the rest of the group might have? Going once? Going
there-
Very
twice?
informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
There
Thank
will
you
be,
so much.
if people have
Thank you.
questions, if people have other questions or things come up, there will be opportunities later to maybe do follow-up stuff. So, you know, just look out for it in your NoMA emails and stuff like that. And I'm happy for you to email me anytime.
And real quick, as we mentioned in the introduction, Patricia is curating the next show. The deadline is the 22nd, so Wednesday. And NoMA will be part of a virtual town hall this Thursday at 6:30. We'll be sharing information on social media, and this covers philanthropy, funding, and technical assistance. So this might be of interest, whether you're an individual artist or part of an arts organization.
Great.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have
Well,
a
if anyone
lovely
wants-
rest of the
Thank you.
weekend.
Thank
Can't
you.
wait to see your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Putting a
Bye-bye.
link in
Take
the
good care.
chat. Thank you.
Take good care,
To
everyone.
the upcoming open call. So if you want to, leaving this meeting, you want to just head over there and check out the open call and see how you're going to prepare your images for it.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
meeting,
Michelle.
everybody.
Thank you,
Okay.
Patricia.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.